The night was silent except for the howling wind, sweeping through the abandoned landfill like a ghost searching for lost souls. Amidst the towering piles of waste and discarded memories, a frail figure lay motionless, her body nothing more than skin stretched over fragile bones. The mother dog, once strong and full of life, had been reduced to a shadow of herself. Her sunken eyes, dulled by exhaustion, barely registered the movement around her. Every breath she took was a struggle, a shallow, labored gasp that barely stirred the dust beneath her. Curled against her shivering frame were her puppies, small, fragile, and helpless. Their tiny bodies, too weak to cry out, trembled as the cold night air seeped into their skin. They huddled together, their bellies empty, their strength slipping away with each passing second. One of them, too feeble to move, only whimpered faintly before falling silent again. Their mother, despite her own suffering, instinctively tightened her body around them, offering what little warmth she had left. Days had passed since they had been left here, forgotten, discarded like the trash that surrounded them. The mother had fought against hunger, against the cold, against the despair clawing at her soul. But now, even she was beginning to surrender. Her eyes fluttered closed, her heartbeat slowing, her body accepting its cruel fate. Then, a light. A beam of brightness cut through the suffocating darkness, sweeping over the scattered debris. Footsteps crunched against the frozen ground, hesitant yet determined. The faint rustle of a jacket, the sharp intake of breath, someone was there. The light hovered over the frail mother and her dying puppies, illuminating their suffering. For the first time in days, hope had found them. A rescuer had come. The night was silent except for the howling wind, sweeping through the abandoned landfill like a ghost searching for lost souls. Amidst the towering piles of waste and discarded memories, a frail figure lay motionless, her body nothing more than skin stretched over fragile bones. The mother dog, once strong and full of life, had been reduced to a shadow of herself. Her sunken eyes, dulled by exhaustion, barely registered the movement around her. Every breath she took was a struggle, a shallow, labored gasp that barely stirred the dust beneath her. Curled against her shivering frame were her puppies, small, fragile, and helpless. Their tiny bodies, too weak to cry out, trembled as the cold night air seeped into their skin. They huddled together, their bellies empty, their strength slipping away with each passing second. One of them, too feeble to move, only whimpered faintly before falling silent again. Their mother, despite her own suffering, instinctively tightened her body around them, offering what little warmth she had left. Days had passed since they had been left here, forgotten, discarded like the trash that surrounded them. The mother had fought against hunger, against the cold, against the despair clawing at her soul. But now, even she was beginning to surrender. Her eyes fluttered closed, her heartbeat slowing, her body accepting its cruel fate. Then, a light. A beam of brightness cut through the suffocating darkness, sweeping over the scattered debris. Footsteps crunched against the frozen ground, hesitant yet determined. The faint rustle of a jacket, the sharp intake of breath, someone was there. The light hovered over the frail mother and her dying puppies, illuminating their suffering. For the first time in days, hope had found them. A rescuer had come. She was motionless, but her eyes, dull and exhausted, flickered open at the intrusion of light. And beneath her, pressed against her frail body, were her puppies. Tiny, shivering creatures, their bodies weak, their cries barely audible. David's heart pounded. He knew he had found them just in time, but would it be enough? The flashlight beam trembled slightly in David's grasp as it revealed a sight so gut-wrenching that his breath caught in his throat. Amid the filth and discarded waste, a frail mother dog lay curled up, her emaciated body forming a fragile shield over her tiny, helpless puppies. Her fur, once thick and warm, was now matted with dirt and grime, clinging to her skeletal frame like a tattered blanket. Her ribs jutted out in sharp relief against her sunken sides, a painful testament to days, perhaps weeks, of hunger. Yet, despite her own suffering, she had wrapped herself around her puppies, using what little warmth she had left to keep them alive. The puppies, barely more than skin and bone, were huddled close to her, their tiny bodies shivering uncontrollably. One of them let out a weak whimper, a sound so feeble it was almost swallowed by the night air. Another puppy lay frighteningly still, its breath so shallow that David feared the worst. The mother dog lifted her head slightly at the intrusion of light, her dull, tired eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them, just exhaustion, a silent plea that reached deeper than words ever could. She did not snarl or attempt to run. She simply watched, as if weighing whether this human meant harm or salvation. David knelt down slowly, his heart aching at the sight before him. He had seen suffering before, but this was different. This was a mother who had given everything to protect her young, enduring starvation, freezing nights, and complete abandonment. And now, she was at the edge of her strength, moments away from fading into the darkness forever. But she had held on. For them. And now, it was David's turn to fight for her. David crouched low, his hand extended, trying to reassure the frail mother dog with a soft whisper. The beam of his flashlight flickered over her emaciated form, casting long shadows against the piles of debris that surrounded them. Her body trembled from exhaustion, but despite her weakness, she remained firmly in place, her thin frame wrapped protectively around her puppies. Her eyes, clouded with fatigue, flickered between the rescuer and her young, her instincts warring against her desperation. She could barely lift her head, yet when David tried to inch closer, she let out a low, breathy whimper, not of aggression, but of pleading. She had suffered for too long, endured days of hunger and nights of freezing cold, but there was one thing she could not allow, leaving her puppies behind. David reached into his bag and pulled out a small piece of food, the scent of which immediately caught her attention. Her nose twitched, her sunken eyes locking onto it. He could see the hunger gnawing at her insides, the primal need urging her forward. But when she moved, it wasn't toward the food, it was toward her puppies. With whatever strength she had left, she nuzzled each one, ensuring they were still there, still alive, still safe beneath her. Even as her stomach twisted in pain, even as her own body cried out for nourishment, her first instinct was them. David swallowed hard. He had seen loyalty before, but this was something else. This was a love so fierce, so unbreakable, that even starvation and suffering couldn't shake it. Carefully, he placed the food closer, watching as she hesitated, then finally took a small bite. Even then, she chewed slowly, her eyes never leaving her puppies. He knew then that there was no force in this world that would make her abandon them. And if she wouldn't give up on them, neither would he. The landfill stretched endlessly under the dim glow of the rescuer's flashlight, a wasteland of twisted metal, broken glass, and decaying refuse. The stench of rot hung thick in the cold night air, mixing with the distant, acrid scent of burning trash. Every step was treacherous, jagged shards of plastic and rusted scraps jutted out from the heaps, ready to cut into flesh at the slightest misstep. David tread carefully, his boots crunching against the uneven ground as he inched closer to the mother dog and her puppies. He could feel the instability beneath him, loose debris shifting, creating the constant risk of a sudden collapse. A misstep here wouldn't just injure him, it could send sharp wreckage tumbling dangerously close to the fragile canine family. The mother dog, weak yet unwavering, lay curled in the midst of the wreckage, unaware, or perhaps too exhausted to care, about the dangers that surrounded her. The puppies, barely old enough to move, were nestled into her frail body, their tiny paws resting against torn pieces of fabric and discarded paper. The very place that had become their shelter was also their greatest threat. David knew time was against them. A wrong move, a sudden shift in the unstable piles of waste, and everything could come crashing down. He scanned the area quickly, calculating the safest way to reach them without triggering a collapse. His fingers tightened around the rescue bag slung over his shoulder. He had to act fast, but carefully. The flashlight's beam flickered over shards of glass glistening like cruel stars in the darkness, over corroded wires snaking through the mess like hidden dangers. The landfill was not just a place of abandonment, it was a death trap. And if he didn't get them out soon, it might become their grave. Taking a deep breath, David steadied himself. This wasn't going to be easy. But no amount of risk could outweigh the desperate, pleading eyes of a mother who had fought so hard to keep her babies alive. David knew that in a rescue like this, patience was everything. The mother dog had survived in this brutal landfill, enduring hunger, cold, and loneliness. Trust was not something she could afford to give easily. If he moved too fast, she might panic; if he hesitated too long, she might lose the last bit of strength keeping her alive. He knelt a few feet away, carefully reaching into his bag. The dim glow of his flashlight flickered over her frail body, highlighting every rib beneath her thin, dirt-matted fur. Her eyes, dull from exhaustion, flickered between him and the small bundle of food he now held in his outstretched hand. "Easy, girl," he murmured, keeping his voice low and soothing. She tensed, her body pressing protectively against her puppies. Even in her weakened state, she was still a mother first. She didn't growl, didn't bare her teeth, just watched him, wary but too weak to run. David placed the food on a scrap of fabric between them, the rich scent of meat and broth cutting through the landfill's foul stench. The mother dog's nose twitched, her hunger momentarily winning over her caution. Slowly, hesitantly, she stretched her neck forward, sniffing the offering. Encouraged, David reached into his pack again and pulled out a bottle of water. He poured some into a small dish and pushed it closer. The moment the water touched the ground, the puppies reacted. One of them, barely strong enough to lift its head, let out a weak whimper. The mother dog's ears flicked toward the sound, and for the first time, she moved, nudging the water closer to her young. David held his breath, watching as she licked at the food cautiously, then, finally, took a bite. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He stayed still, allowing her to eat, resisting the urge to rush the moment. This was more than just food. This was a silent agreement, a fragile thread of trust forming between them. And for the first time that night, David knew, she wanted to believe in him. David had been so focused on earning the mother dog's trust that he almost missed it, the sudden stillness of one of the puppies. At first, he thought it was simply exhaustion, but then he noticed that the tiny body wasn't shivering like the others. The weak, rhythmic rise and fall of its chest had slowed, barely perceptible in the dim light of his flashlight. His heart clenched. "No, no, stay with me, little one," he muttered, inching forward carefully. The mother dog stiffened as he moved, her tired eyes flicking from his outstretched hand to the unmoving puppy. She let out a soft whimper, nudging the tiny form with her nose, trying to wake it. The other puppies squirmed slightly, their feeble cries barely audible over the rustling wind. But this one wasn't responding. David could feel the urgency rising in his chest. He had seen this before, puppies on the brink of fading, their tiny bodies too weak to hold on much longer. He needed to act fast. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out a soft, warm cloth and carefully extended it toward the mother dog. She watched him, hesitant but desperate. When she didn't react aggressively, he gently scooped up the limp puppy, wrapping it in the fabric. It was too cold, too still. He could feel the faintest pulse beneath his fingers, but it was weakening. David rubbed the tiny body gently, trying to stimulate warmth, whispering reassurances even though the puppy couldn't hear him. The mother dog let out another whimper, shifting anxiously but not stopping him. She knew. She understood. The landfill, the biting cold, the treacherous debris, none of it mattered at that moment. All that mattered was getting this little soul back. David took a deep breath, his mind racing for solutions. He wasn't going to lose this puppy. Not now. Not when they had come so far. David's hands trembled as he cradled the motionless puppy, the tiny body barely responding to his attempts to warm it. His heart pounded in his chest, he had to act fast. Every second that passed pushed the fragile life in his hands closer to the edge. With one arm holding the puppy securely, he reached for his radio with the other, his fingers fumbling in his haste. He pressed the button, his voice urgent but steady. "This is David, I need backup immediately. I have a critical situation. One of the puppies is unresponsive, and the mother is severely malnourished. I need medical support now." Static crackled in response before a voice came through. "Copy that, David. Hold tight, we're sending a team your way. ETA 10 minutes. 10 minutes. David swallowed hard. 10 minutes could mean the difference between life and death. He couldn't afford to wait, he had to keep trying. David could feel the mother dog's entire body trembling beneath his touch. Every time his hand moved closer, whether to check on the puppies or to reassure her, she flinched, her muscles tightening as if bracing for the worst. Her eyes, weary and sunken, darted between him and her fragile babies, torn between fear and the desperate hope that he might be here to help. He moved slowly, careful not to startle her. "It's okay, girl," he murmured, his voice steady despite the urgency pressing on him. "I know you're scared, but I need to help them." She let out a soft whimper, her body half curled around her remaining puppies. Even in her weakness, her instincts as a mother overpowered everything else. David placed the limp puppy gently in the warm cloth, continuing to rub its tiny body in an attempt to revive it. The mother dog let out a distressed whine, inching forward but hesitating just before she touched him. She wanted to help, but uncertainty still held her back. The cold wind cut through the landfill, rustling broken scraps of debris. The harsh environment had taken everything from her: food, warmth, safety. The only thing she had left was the instinct to protect her babies, even if it meant keeping her distance from a man she didn't fully trust. David felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a rescue. This was a battle between survival and surrender, between the trauma of abandonment and the fragile possibility of salvation. He exhaled softly, lowering his hand onto the ground beside her instead of reaching for her directly. A silent offer. A choice. For the first time, the mother dog didn't pull away. She didn't move closer, but she didn't retreat either. It was a small step, but sometimes, in a fight for survival, the smallest steps mattered the most. The air was thick with urgency as David heard the crunch of approaching footsteps. Backup had arrived. A second rescuer, a woman named Sarah, knelt beside him, her gloved hands reaching for the frail puppies. "They're so cold," she whispered, gently lifting the tiniest one and tucking it into a soft, insulated blanket. David carefully handed her the weakest pup, the one he had been trying to warm, his heart pounding as he watched for any sign of movement. The mother dog let out a low, uneasy whimper as she saw her babies being taken. She tensed, her malnourished body trembling, torn between exhaustion and the instinct to fight. David moved slowly, placing a reassuring hand on her side. "We're not taking them away, girl. We're helping." His voice was calm, steady, offering the trust she so desperately needed. Sarah worked quickly, wrapping each puppy securely in the warmth of the blanket, shielding them from the biting cold. The little bodies, so fragile, barely stirred. Every second counted. Now came the hardest part, moving the mother dog. David exchanged a look with Sarah. They both knew that if they rushed this, she could panic. She was weak, but fear could give her the strength to bolt, and if she ran, they might never find her again. Slowly, David shifted closer. "Come on, sweetheart," he whispered. "Let's get you out of here." The mother dog's ribs pressed against her thin coat as she breathed heavily, her tired eyes darting between her puppies and the strangers who were trying to save them. Then, with a deep sigh, as if surrendering to whatever fate had in store, she finally allowed them to help. Sarah gently lifted the puppies, keeping them close to her chest for warmth, while David carefully reached for the mother dog. She flinched but didn't fight. With slow, deliberate movements, he wrapped her in a soft blanket, lifting her into his arms. She let out one last exhausted whimper, then rested her head against his chest. The rescue mission wasn't over yet. But for the first time, David knew, they had a real chance to save them all. 11 David felt the weight of the mother dog in his arms, her frail body barely resisting, but she wasn't fully surrendering either. As Sarah carefully secured the puppies in a warm blanket, the mother lifted her head slightly, her tired eyes scanning the landfill around her. This was all she had ever known. The filth, the scraps, the biting wind, it had been her home, her battlefield, her prison. She whimpered softly, her ears twitching as if listening for something familiar, something to ground her. Her instinct told her to protect her puppies, to stay where she knew how to survive. But the warmth of David's arms, the soft blanket wrapped around her, and the gentle way he held her, it was all so unfamiliar. She turned her head, glancing toward the pile of broken debris she had used as shelter. This place had given her nothing but suffering, yet it was the only thing she understood. The unknown frightened her more than the cold. David could feel her hesitation, the uncertainty in the way her body tensed slightly in his arms. He didn't rush her. He simply held her, whispering words of reassurance. "I know it's scary," he murmured. "But I promise, you don't have to suffer anymore." Sarah knelt beside them, carefully adjusting the puppies in her arms. "She's afraid," she said softly, watching the mother dog's conflicted expression. David nodded. "She's spent so long fighting to survive. She doesn't know what it's like to be safe." The mother dog whimpered again, shifting slightly, as if torn between her past and an uncertain future. But then, a tiny sound broke through the cold night, the faintest whimper from one of her puppies, nestled safely in Sarah's arms. The mother's ears perked up, and she turned toward them. David felt it, the moment she made her choice. With one last look at the place she had once called home, she exhaled a heavy, exhausted sigh and rested her head against his chest. She was ready to leave it behind. David could feel the mother dog's hesitation, her frail body trembling slightly in his arms. She had survived in this unforgiving landfill for so long, relying only on herself, never knowing a gentle touch or a kind voice. Trust did not come easily. Her tired eyes darted between the rescuers and the darkness behind them, the world she had fought so hard to endure. The scraps, the filth, the sharp winds, this place had been cruel, but it had been her reality. And now, she was being carried away from it. David held her close, feeling her shallow breaths against his chest. He knew she was scared, but she wasn't resisting. "You're safe now," he whispered softly. "No more suffering. No more fear." His voice was steady, warm, unwavering. He moved slowly, ensuring she felt no sudden jolts, no reason to panic. Every motion was deliberate, meant to reassure her that this was different, this was kindness, not harm. Sarah cradled the puppies nearby, tucking them deeper into the warmth of the blankets. Their tiny bodies barely stirred, but their faint breaths were a sign of hope. The mother dog let out a low, almost questioning whimper. David gave her a gentle squeeze, his heartbeat steady beneath her frail frame. "They need you," he murmured, nodding toward her puppies. "And you need them. Let's get you all somewhere safe." For the first time, the mother dog didn't look back. Her body, still weak but no longer stiff with fear, relaxed slightly in his arms. The chains of terror that had bound her for so long were breaking, piece by piece. She wasn't just being rescued. She was learning what it felt like to be saved. The cold night air pressed against them as David and Sarah hurried toward their rescue van, cradling their fragile passengers. The mother dog, still weak but no longer struggling, lay in David's arms, her head resting against his chest. Her puppies, wrapped in layers of warm blankets, barely stirred in Sarah's gentle grip. Time was slipping away, and they knew every second mattered. David climbed into the back of the van, carefully placing the mother dog onto a soft bed of blankets. She whimpered softly as he knelt beside her, stroking her head with steady hands. "You're okay," he whispered. We're almost there. Sarah slid into the passenger seat, her grip tightening around the tiny, barely moving puppies. She turned toward the driver, one of their team members, Jake, her voice firm but urgent. Drive. Fast, the engine roared to life, tires crunching against gravel as the van sped down the empty roads. Inside, the dim glow of a small cabin light flickered, illuminating the heartbreaking sight, an exhausted mother, her ribs still painfully visible, curled around her tiny, struggling pups. David reached for a portable heating pad, placing it gently against the puppies. Their small bodies were dangerously cold. He rubbed them carefully, trying to stimulate warmth, his jaw clenched with determination. Come on, little ones, he murmured. Hold on. The mother dog lifted her head weakly, watching him. There was no more hesitation in her eyes, only exhaustion and a silent plea. Sarah turned back, glancing at the GPS. 10 more minutes, she said. They're expecting us. David nodded, his focus never shifting from the small lives in front of him. Just a little longer, he whispered. We're getting you home. The city lights flickered in the distance, a beacon of hope cutting through the darkness. The shelter was near. Safety was near. And for the first time in too long, the mother dog and her puppies had a real chance to survive. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air as David and Sarah rushed into the animal shelter, their arms full of fragile lives. The veterinarian, Dr. Collins, was already waiting with her team, urgency in her eyes as she gestured toward an examination table. Get them here, quickly, she instructed, pulling on a pair of gloves. David gently placed the mother dog onto the soft bedding, but instead of relaxing, she immediately lifted her head, her weary eyes locked onto her puppies. Sarah unwrapped the tiny bodies from the warm blankets, and the vet's assistants quickly got to work, checking each one for signs of life. 2 of the puppies stirred weakly, their tiny paws twitching as warmth returned to their bodies. But one remained frighteningly still. No, come on, Sarah whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she rubbed the lifeless pup's tiny chest. Dr. Collins moved quickly, grabbing a tiny oxygen mask and placing it over the puppy's face. He's critical, she said, her voice calm but firm. But we're not giving up. The mother dog let out a weak whimper, attempting to move toward her babies, but her strength gave out. She collapsed back onto the bed, her breathing shallow but steady. She's severely malnourished, Dr. Collins said, carefully examining her frail body. She needs fluids, warmth, and rest, but she's a fighter. David knelt beside the mother dog, stroking her head gently. You made it, he murmured. Now let us help them. Minutes stretched on like hours as the team worked. The mother dog received 4 fluids, her body gradually regaining some warmth. The weakest puppy remained unresponsive, its tiny chest barely rising and falling. Sarah refused to stop rubbing it, whispering words of encouragement as if sheer willpower could bring it back. And then, the smallest sound, a faint, almost imperceptible squeak. Sarah gasped. He's breathing. The room, once tense with silence, filled with cautious hope. The battle wasn't over, but they had won this round. The mother dog, as if sensing the shift, let out a small sigh and closed her eyes, not in fear, but in trust. For the first time in her life, she and her puppies weren't alone in their fight to survive. Sunlight streamed through the shelter's large windows, casting a warm glow over the newly renovated play area. The sound of playful yips filled the air as 3 energetic puppies tumbled over each other, their once frail bodies now full of life. Sitting nearby, their mother watched with gentle eyes, her coat no longer dull and patchy but thick and healthy. She lay with a peaceful expression, her body finally free of the aches of hunger and exhaustion. David knelt beside her, running a hand over her soft fur. You did it, girl, he whispered. You got them through. It had been weeks of round-the-clock care, moments of fear and uncertainty, and a battle to bring them back from the brink. The weakest puppy had fought the hardest, but now, he ran alongside his siblings, his tail wagging excitedly. Sarah stood at the shelter's entrance, a warm smile on her face as a young couple approached. Their eyes shone with love and anticipation as they stepped forward, kneeling to greet the mother dog and her puppies. "She's beautiful," the woman murmured, reaching out hesitantly. The mother dog sniffed her hand, then, to everyone's joy, leaned in, accepting the touch. "She's been through a lot," David said, watching the moment unfold. "But she never stopped fighting." The couple exchanged a look, the decision already made in their hearts. A short while later, the mother dog and her puppies were nestled in the back seat of a car, wrapped in soft blankets, on their way to their forever home. She turned back once, gazing at the shelter as if saying goodbye to the P.